The private hospital corridor stretched before Naomi Carter as another contraction seized her body. Her husband refused to authorize payment for her admission, his voice cutting through the sterile air when he declared she wasn't worth draining his finances. Calvin Carter stood beside his mistress, a nurse who'd been whispering in his ear for months, their hands clasped while Naomi gripped the admission desk alone, swollen belly pressing against cold marble. What Calvin didn't know, what nobody in that hushed hallway could have imagined, was that the quiet woman he'd just dismissed owned the building they stood in. The acquisition had finalized 3 days earlier, silent and complete, transforming Naomi from abandoned wife to primary shareholder with a single signature her attorney had secured while Calvin slept beside her, planning his escape. When Calvin's mother arrived and sneered at Naomi's condition, calling her a financial burden despite the child she carried, Naomi made a decision that would erase him from the life he thought he controlled. The nurse who'd stolen her husband would soon discover her employment terminated, license under ethics review, but that would be merely the opening move in a process already set in motion. Calvin had gambled everything on a woman he'd underestimated, never suspecting that the wife he'd dismissed had built a portfolio while he'd built nothing but betrayals. But what happens when a man who abandons his wife in labor discovers the woman he discarded owns the ground beneath his feet? When his mother's cruel laughter turns to desperate confusion, will Naomi choose mercy or the mechanical efficiency of consequences already in motion? What will Calvin do when he realizes the nurse he chose over his wife now has nothing, while the wife he rejected holds everything? This story reveals the cost of taking people for granted, the quiet strength in those we underestimate, and how arrogance blinds us to the value of what we dismiss. You will witness that true character emerges in crisis, that material wealth means nothing without integrity, and that the people we hurt most are often the ones with the power to either include or exclude us from the future. The fluorescent lights hummed as Naomi Carter pressed her palm against the cool wall, her water having broken 18 minutes earlier in the parking garage. Contractions were accelerating now, each one a reminder that her body was preparing to bring new life into a world about to shift beneath her husband's feet. But the man who'd helped create that life was preparing to walk away. Calvin stood 12 feet down the corridor, phone pressed to his ear while his other hand rested possessively on another woman's lower back. Vanessa Reed, the obstetrics nurse who'd been working the night shift when Calvin had accompanied Naomi to her first prenatal appointment 8 months ago, before he'd stopped coming altogether. "I'm not authorizing this," Calvin said, loud enough that the night admissions clerk looked up from her screen, fingers freezing over the keyboard. "Naomi has her own accounts. She can figure out how to cover a hospital bill." The words landed with surgical precision. Yet Naomi remained standing through sheer discipline, hand moving from the wall to cradle her belly as if she could shield her unborn child from the ugliness unfolding 3 yards away. She'd known for 7 weeks that Calvin was having an affair, the late-night emergency meetings that her discreet investigator had documented with photographs so clear she could see Vanessa's lipstick on his collar before he'd even removed his jacket. What Calvin didn't know, what nobody in this building except her attorney and the hospital's board understood, was that Naomi had been born Naomi Sinclair, principal heir to Sinclair Capital Management, a discreet investment firm that had quietly acquired controlling stakes in medical facilities, technology startups, and commercial real estate across 19 states. Her grandfather had died 14 months ago, leaving her a discretionary trust worth $4.2 billion and operational control of the firm. But what the reflection couldn't show was the network of systems already moving, the authority already established, the consequences already set in motion by decisions made weeks ago when she'd still hoped, foolishly, she now understood, that Calvin might surprise her. The wheelchair turned a corner, and the admission area disappeared from view. Behind her, the clerk was already pulling up internal directories, curiosity piqued by the exchange she'd witnessed. Ahead, the delivery room waited with its monitors and bright lights and the promise of new life. And 3 floors above, in the administrative wing that had closed hours ago, an email sat in an inbox, unread but already scheduled for automatic distribution at 6 a.m. Subject: Board update. Ownership transition effective immediately. Naomi touched her belly as another contraction began its climb, and she sent the message. The systems were moving now, and Calvin had no idea what he'd just set in motion by walking through those doors. 5 years earlier, Naomi Sinclair had met Calvin Carter at a nonprofit fundraising gala where she'd been volunteering as an event coordinator. He was a mid-level sales manager for a medical equipment company, charming in an effortless way, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. She'd been drawn to his straightforwardness. After years of navigating family wealth and the suspicion that came with it, people wanting access to her grandfather, to the Sinclair name, to the portfolio that funded scholarships and research grants, Calvin's ignorance of her background had felt like relief. He didn't know who she was, didn't recognize the name, didn't ask probing questions about her family or her real job. He'd asked her to coffee, then dinner, then a weekend trip to a cabin upstate where they'd talked about everything except money. His dreams of running his own consulting firm someday, her work coordinating youth programs, the books they'd read, the cities they wanted to visit. When he proposed 6 months later in that same cabin, with a modest ring he'd saved for and a speech about building a life together from scratch, Naomi had said yes without hesitation. She'd told herself it was romantic, a fresh start, a chance to be loved for herself rather than her assets. Her grandfather had been less convinced. "You're going to marry a man who doesn't know who you are?" he'd asked over tea in his study, weathered hands wrapped around a porcelain cup that had belonged to Naomi's grandmother. "That's not romance, Naomi. That's deception. It's privacy," Naomi had corrected gently. "And it's my choice." Her grandfather had sighed, recognizing the Sinclair stubbornness he'd passed down. "Then make it a test with an end date. Give it 5 years. If he loves you truly, without knowing what you have, then tell him. But if he shows you who he is under pressure." He'd trailed off, leaving the implication unfinished. Naomi had agreed. 5 years. She could manage 5 years of modest living, of being just Naomi, of seeing whether Calvin's love could survive what he perceived as financial limitation. The first year had been easy. They'd lived in a small apartment in a neighborhood Calvin chose, splitting rent down the middle. Naomi had worked her nonprofit job, meaningful work she'd have done regardless of her wealth, and Calvin had climbed steadily at his company, proud of every promotion, every raise, every step toward the consulting firm he dreamed of opening. The second year had shown the first cracks. Calvin's mother, Lorraine, had moved to the city after her divorce, bringing with her a sense of entitlement that no longer matched her financial reality. She'd been married to a successful attorney who'd left her for a younger colleague, and the divorce settlement, generous by most standards, had been rapidly depleted by a lifestyle Lorraine refused to adjust. She'd looked at Naomi's modest car, modest clothes, modest apartment, and made her assessment immediately. "My son could have done better," Lorraine had said at their first family dinner, voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that masqueraded as honesty. "But I suppose love makes us foolish." Calvin had laughed it off. "Mom's just protective." But Naomi had seen the way he'd looked at her afterward, a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment or agreement, or both. By the third year, Calvin's resentment had begun to calcify. His company had promoted someone else to the director role he'd been promised. His consulting plans had stalled for lack of startup capital. His mother's complaints about money had intensified, and she'd begun asking Calvin for loans he couldn't afford to give. And Naomi, working at a nonprofit that paid her $52,000 a year, couldn't help. Or rather, wouldn't help, because helping would have required revelation, and revelation would have ended the test. "I just don't understand why you won't ask for a raise," Calvin had said one night, frustration sharpening his tone. "Or look for something in the private sector. You're smart enough. You could be making twice that." "I like my work," Naomi had said simply. "Your work doesn't pay our bills. It pays my half." The silence that had followed had been thick with unspoken accusations. Vanessa Reed had entered their lives during the 4th year, during Naomi's first prenatal appointment. She'd been professional, friendly, efficient. She'd asked about Naomi's medical history, checked her vitals, explained what to expect over the coming months. And she'd smiled at Calvin in a way that Naomi had recognized immediately, the smile of a woman assessing opportunity. Calvin had started mentioning her casually. "Vanessa said the baby's development is right on track. Vanessa recommended this prenatal vitamin. Vanessa thinks we should consider a birthing class." By the 6th month of pregnancy, Calvin had stopped coming to appointments altogether. "I'm slammed at work," he'd say. "You can fill me in later." Naomi had hired the investigator in her 7th month, not because she wanted confirmation, but because she needed documentation. Not for confrontation. She had no interest in begging Calvin to stay, but for clarity. The photographs had arrived 3 weeks later. Calvin and Vanessa at restaurants Naomi couldn't afford. Calvin and Vanessa leaving a hotel. Calvin and Vanessa in his car, parked in a location the investigator had timestamped during hours Calvin had claimed to be in client meetings. Naomi had looked at each image with the same detached assessment she'd used reviewing a quarterly investment report. The data was clear. The conclusion was inevitable. The marriage was over. The question was what to do about it. She could have confronted him immediately, could have thrown the photographs on the table and demanded explanation, apology, change. But Naomi had learned from her grandfather that the most important business decisions were never made in anger. They were made in cold clarity, with full information, with systems in place. So instead of confronting Calvin, Naomi had called her attorney. "I need you to finalize the hospital acquisition, the one we've been negotiating for the past 18 months. I want it completed before the baby comes." Her attorney had been quiet for a moment. "Naomi, are you sure? That's a $340 million deal. We can wait until after." "I'm sure. And I want compliance protocols updated across all hospital staff. Full ethics reviews. I want every policy enforced, no exceptions." The acquisition had closed 3 days before Naomi went into labor. Sinclair Capital Management now owned controlling interest in Mercy Heights Medical Center and its affiliated facilities. The board had been notified. The transition paperwork was filed. The authority was established. Calvin still had no idea. He'd been too busy planning his exit with Vanessa, too focused on his own narrative of escape, too certain that Naomi had nothing, was nothing, without him. And when Naomi's water broke in the parking garage of the very hospital her company now owned, she'd called Calvin not because she expected him to come, but because she wanted to see if he would. The test had an answer now, and Naomi was ready to grade it. The delivery had taken 11 hours. Sharon, the nurse who'd wheeled Naomi to the delivery room, had stayed through the entire process, her presence steady and unobtrusive. She'd held Naomi's hand during contractions, adjusted monitors, provided ice chips and quiet encouragement, never once asking about the husband who hadn't returned. At 6:47 a.m., Naomi's daughter was born. She was small, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, with dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume. The doctor placed her on Naomi's chest, and for a moment, the world contracted to just the two of them, mother and daughter, beginning. "She's beautiful," Sharon said softly. Naomi looked down at her daughter's face, at the tiny features still adjusting to life outside the womb, and felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness. She was too exhausted, too aware of everything that had just shattered, but purpose. This child would not grow up watching her mother beg for respect. This child would not learn that love meant tolerating cruelty. This child would see what strength looked like when it didn't need to announce itself. "Her name is Claire," Naomi said, "after my grandmother." Sharon entered the information into the system, and Naomi watched the letters appear. Claire Sinclair Carter. The last name would change soon enough. But for now, it was accurate. While Naomi was giving birth, other systems were moving. At 6 a.m., the email her attorney had drafted went out to all Mercy Heights Medical Center staff. Subject: Board Update. Ownership transition effective immediately. Dear Mercy Heights team, effective October 15th, Sinclair Capital Management has completed acquisition of majority ownership in Mercy Heights Medical Center and affiliated facilities. This transition has been planned for 18 months and represents our commitment to maintaining excellence in patient care while strengthening operational standards. All existing employment contracts remain valid. However, as part of our integration process, we will be implementing comprehensive compliance reviews across all departments to ensure alignment with Sinclair Capital's ethics standards and patient care protocols. Department heads will receive detailed information by end of business today. If you have questions, please direct them to Human Resources. Thank you for your continued dedication to our patients. Sincerely, Patricia Vance, Chief Operating Officer, Sinclair Capital Management Healthcare Division. The email landed in 847 inboxes. Most staff skimmed it, filed it away, and went about their shifts. Ownership changes happened. The work remained the same. But in the obstetrics department, several people read it more carefully. Sharon, checking her email during her break, went very still. She pulled up the employee directory, searched for a name, then looked down the hall toward the private recovery room where Naomi Carter was resting with her newborn. Carter. Sinclair. Sharon closed her laptop and made a mental note to be very professional for the rest of her shift. In the staff lounge, Vanessa Reed was scrolling through her phone when her colleague nudged her. "Did you see the email about the ownership change?" "What email?" Vanessa asked, irritated. She'd been texting Calvin, trying to coordinate when he could leave work to see her. "Check your work email. Some investment company bought the hospital." Vanessa switched to her email app and scanned the message. Sinclair Capital Management. Compliance reviews. Ethics standards. She felt a small flutter of unease but pushed it aside. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd followed all protocols, maintained all certifications, documented everything properly. The fact that she was sleeping with a patient's husband was personal, not professional. She went back to texting Calvin. 3 floors above the obstetrics ward, in the administrative wing, Patricia Vance was meeting with the hospital's department heads. "The compliance reviews begin Monday," she said, tone crisp and efficient. "We'll be examining employee conduct, patient care protocols, billing practices, and ethics compliance. This is standard procedure for all Sinclair Capital acquisitions. Nothing to panic about if you've been running your departments properly." The chief of obstetrics, Dr. Rahman, raised his hand. "How extensive are we talking?" "Every employee, every department. We'll be reviewing the past 24 months of activity. Any red flags, and I mean any, will be escalated immediately." Dr. Rahman made a note. "I'll inform my staff." What he didn't say, what he was already calculating, was whether there was anything in his department that might constitute a red flag. There was a nurse, Vanessa Reed. Excellent clinically, but there had been concerns about professional boundaries, about her tendency to develop close relationships with patients' families. Nothing actionable, nothing documented, but under a compliance review, Dr. Rahman made another note to pull her file. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Calvin's mother was having a very bad morning. Lorraine Carter had woken to an email from her bank. Subject: loan payment past due, immediate action required. She'd been carrying a home equity line of credit for 3 years, using it to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during her marriage. The monthly payments had been manageable as long as she could make the minimums. But the minimums had recently increased. Her request for an extension had been denied, and the language in the email was concerning. Failure to bring account current within 30 days may result in foreclosure proceedings. Lorraine called the bank, was transferred, put on hold, finally reached someone in collections. "I need to speak to someone about my loan terms," she said, voice carrying the authoritative tone that used to make bank representatives scramble. "I can see your account, Mrs. Carter. You're currently 47 days past due. We've sent multiple notices." "I know that. I'm calling to negotiate better terms." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Your loan was sold to another servicer last week as part of a portfolio acquisition. They'll be contacting you directly about payment options." Lorraine felt ice in her stomach. Sold? To whom? The representative gave her a name that meant nothing to Lorraine. Sinclair Capital Asset Recovery. What Lorraine didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Sinclair Capital had been quietly acquiring distressed debt portfolios across the region for the past 6 months. Standard business practice. Nothing personal, except when it was. Naomi hadn't specifically targeted her mother-in-law's debt. She hadn't needed to. Lorraine's financial situation had been precarious for years, built on leverage and assumption and the belief that someone would always bail her out. Now that someone would be Sinclair Capital. And Sinclair Capital didn't negotiate with people who couldn't pay. Back at the hospital, Calvin tried to visit. He'd waited until midday, assuming Naomi would have given birth by then, assuming he could make a brief appearance, see the baby, and maintain the appearance of civility. He arrived at the maternity ward with Vanessa, her hand in his, both smiling like they belonged there. The nurse at the reception desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see my wife, Naomi Carter. She had a baby this morning." The nurse checked her computer. "And you are?" "Calvin Carter, the father." The nurse's expression didn't change. "One moment." She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, then hung up. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter has restricted visitors to approved individuals only. You're not on the list. Calvin blinked. What? That doesn't make sense. I'm her husband. I understand. But those are her instructions. This is ridiculous. I have a right to see my own child. The nurse's expression remained professionally neutral. You're welcome to contact Mrs. Carter directly to discuss visitor access. But I can't admit you to the ward without authorization. Vanessa stepped forward, nurse credentials visible on her lanyard. I work here. Surely I can. Not on this floor. The nurse said, tone a shade cooler. And even if you did, the same visitor restrictions would apply. Calvin felt heat rising in his face. Get your supervisor. Of course. The nurse picked up the phone again. 5 minutes later, a senior floor manager arrived. She listened to Calvin's complaint with patient attention, checked the same computer, and came to the same conclusion. Mrs. Carter has the right to control access to her room and her child. If you'd like to challenge that restriction, you'll need to go through legal channels. Legal channels? Calvin's voice was rising. I left for one night, and suddenly I need a lawyer to see my own baby? You left, the manager said quietly, before she was admitted. Before she gave birth. That's in the notes. Calvin froze. The manager continued, tone professional but pointed. Mrs. Carter was in active labor when you departed the premises. That's documented. Security footage confirms the timeline. So if you want to discuss access rights, I suggest you start with an apology rather than threats. She turned and walked away. Calvin stood in the hallway, Vanessa beside him, both suddenly unsure. This is insane, Vanessa whispered. She can't just keep you from your own child. But even as she said it, Vanessa was remembering the email, the compliance review, the ethics standards. She was standing in a hospital hallway, holding hands with a patient's husband, having just been denied access to that patient's room. A patient she'd provided prenatal care for. A patient whose husband she'd been sleeping with for 6 months. Vanessa dropped Calvin's hand. I should get back to work, she said quickly. And for the first time since this had started, Calvin saw something in her eyes that looked like doubt. The next 72 hours unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. Calvin tried calling Naomi. The calls went straight to voicemail. He tried texting. The messages showed as delivered but received no response. He tried showing up at the hospital again. Security informed him that Mrs. Carter had been discharged and was recovering at a private location. What private location? Calvin demanded. We're not authorized to share that information. He tried going to their apartment. The locks had been changed. Standing outside the door with his key card refusing to work, Calvin felt the first real stirrings of panic. He called Naomi's work. Her supervisor informed him that Naomi was on parental leave and would not be reachable for the next 12 weeks. I'm her husband. This is an emergency. Then I suggest you contact her attorney. Her attorney? She doesn't have an attorney. There was a pause. Sir, I'm not comfortable continuing this conversation. If you need to reach Ms. Sinclair, her legal representation is. Ms. Sinclair. Calvin interrupted. Her name is Carter. Another pause, longer. I apologize. I misspoke. I'll have someone from HR return your call. The line went dead. Calvin stared at his phone, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Sinclair. Why did that name sound familiar? Vanessa's situation was deteriorating faster. On Monday morning, she'd been called into Dr. Ramon's office. Vanessa, we need to discuss some concerns that have come up during the compliance review. She'd sat down, maintaining her professional composure. What concerns? There are indications of inappropriate relationships with patients' families. Specifically, Calvin Carter. Vanessa's face had gone carefully blank. I don't know what you mean. Dr. Ramon had pulled out a file. We have security footage of you and Mr. Carter leaving the hospital together on multiple occasions. We have documentation that you provided prenatal care to his wife. We have reports from other staff members indicating that your interactions with Mr. Carter exceeded professional boundaries. I was just being friendly, Vanessa said, voice tight. You were in a relationship with a patient's spouse while providing medical care to that patient. That's a clear ethics violation, Vanessa. You know that. Nothing I did affected Naomi's care. That's not the point. The point is that you violated patient trust and professional boundaries. And under our new ownership, those violations have consequences. Dr. Ramon had slid a packet of papers across the desk. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full ethics investigation. Your access to patient files is suspended. Your nursing license will be reported to the state board for review. Vanessa had gone pale. You can't do this. I've done nothing wrong. You conducted a sexual relationship with a patient's husband while serving as that patient's care provider. In some states, that's grounds for criminal prosecution. In all states, it's grounds for license suspension. You're lucky we're giving you the option to resign. Resign. If you resign within the next 48 hours, we'll document this as a voluntary separation. If you don't, we'll proceed with termination for cause, and that will follow you to every future employer. Vanessa had left the office in a daze. By the time she reached her car, she had 17 missed calls from Calvin. She didn't return them. Calvin's mother was having an even worse week. On Tuesday, she received official notice that her home equity line of credit had been called in full. She had 30 days to pay the entire balance, $127,000, or face foreclosure. She'd called the number on the letter and been connected to Sinclair Capital Asset Recovery. I need to arrange a payment plan, Lorraine had said, trying to sound calm. Our records indicate you've missed 3 consecutive payments, Mrs. Carter. At this point, we're past payment plans. You'll need to satisfy the debt in full or surrender the property. That's impossible. I can't pay $127,000 in 30 days. Then I suggest you consult with a bankruptcy attorney. Wait, can't we negotiate? Can't we work something out? Sinclair Capital doesn't negotiate with defaulted borrowers. Those are our terms. You have 29 days remaining. The line had gone dead. Lorraine had immediately called Calvin. Your wife did this, she'd hissed into the phone. I don't know how, but I know she did. Mom, Naomi doesn't have that kind of money. She works at a nonprofit. Then who? Who else would target me like this? Calvin hadn't had an answer, but he was starting to wonder. On Wednesday, Calvin received a certified letter at his office. It was from a law firm he'd never heard of, Mitchell & Crane, LLP. Inside was a petition for divorce, a request for full custody of the minor child Claire Sinclair Carter, and a restraining order prohibiting Calvin from contacting Naomi except through legal representation. There was also a financial disclosure form. Calvin had read it 3 times before the numbers started to make sense. Naomi's declared assets, $4.2 billion in trust funds and discretionary accounts. Her position, principal heir and managing director, Sinclair Capital Management. Her annual income, $87 million in dividends and investment returns. Calvin had sat at his desk, the papers spread in front of him, hands shaking. Sinclair, the hospital ownership change, the compliance review, Vanessa's suspension, his mother's loan being called, the locks changed, the visitor restrictions, all of it, all connected to one name. Sinclair. His wife was a billionaire. His wife owned the hospital. His wife had watched him abandon her in labor, and she'd said nothing. She'd just let the consequences unfold. Calvin had grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Where are you going? His manager asked. I need to fix something. You have a client meeting in 20 minutes. Reschedule it. Calvin had driven to the one place he knew Naomi might be, her grandfather's estate, a property she'd mentioned once in passing but never taken him to. The address had been in the divorce papers. 2247 Lakeshore Drive. He'd expected a nice house, maybe even a large house. What he'd found was an estate that covered 12 acres, with a main house that looked like it belonged in a European travel magazine, surrounded by gardens and a private gate with an intercom system. Calvin had pressed the button. A voice answered. Yes. I need to speak with Naomi Sinclair. Who's calling? Her husband. Calvin Carter. There was a pause. 1 moment. Calvin had waited, heart pounding, rehearsing what he'd say. The voice came back. Miss Sinclair is not receiving visitors. Please contact her legal representation if you need to communicate with her. I don't want to talk to her lawyers. I want to talk to her. That's not possible. Tell her I'm not leaving until she talks to me. Another pause. Sir, if you don't leave the property voluntarily, we'll contact law enforcement. This is insane, Calvin shouted at the intercom. Naomi, I know you can hear me. Just talk to me. Silence. Calvin stood there for 10 minutes, pressing the button again and again, until finally a private security vehicle pulled up behind his car. Sir, you need to leave this property. I'm trying to talk to my wife. Sir, there's a restraining order preventing you from contacting Miss Sinclair. If you don't leave now, you'll be arrested for violation. Calvin had left. He'd driven home. Except it wasn't home anymore. because the locks were changed and his name wasn't on the lease. He'd gone to a hotel, and he'd sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the divorce papers, trying to understand how his life had disintegrated in less than a week. His phone rang. It was Vanessa. "Calvin, I can't do this anymore." "Can't do what?" "This. Us. I lost my job because of you. I might lose my nursing license. I can't. I can't be involved in whatever this is." "Vanessa, wait. Don't call me again." She hung up. Calvin sat in the silence of a hotel room that cost $140 a night. Money he didn't really have, charging to a credit card that was probably close to maxed out. And finally understood what Naomi had meant in the hospital corridor. "You're making a choice right now that will define everything that follows." He'd made his choice, and now he was living with it. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were served, Calvin received notice of a court hearing. He'd hired an attorney, the cheapest one he could find, who would take a case against what his lawyer delicately called significant opposing resources. "I need you to understand something," his lawyer had said during their first meeting. "Your wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, has essentially unlimited legal resources. Sinclair Capital Management has a legal department larger than most law firms. If she wants to fight this, she can fight it forever." "I just want to see my daughter," Calvin said. "Then I suggest you be very agreeable at this hearing." The hearing was held in family court on a gray November morning. Calvin arrived early, his lawyer beside him, both dressed in their best approximation of respectability. Naomi arrived exactly on time. She was accompanied by 3 attorneys, all wearing suits that probably cost more than Calvin's car. She looked composed, professional, completely recovered from childbirth. Hair pulled back, expression neutral, posture suggesting someone attending a business meeting rather than a custody hearing. Calvin tried to make eye contact. She didn't look at him once. The judge reviewed the filings. "This is a petition for divorce with a request for full physical and legal custody of the minor child, Claire Sinclair Carter. Mr. Carter, you're contesting the custody arrangement?" Calvin's lawyer stood. "My client is seeking joint custody and standard visitation, Your Honor." The judge looked at Naomi's lead attorney. "Ms. Mitchell." The attorney stood. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. "Your Honor, we're not contesting Mr. Carter's right to visitation. However, we are requesting that any visitation be supervised and occur at neutral locations until Mr. Carter demonstrates stable housing and financial circumstances." "Supervised?" Calvin blurted out before his lawyer could stop him. The judge looked at him. "Mr. Carter, you'll have an opportunity to respond." "Ms. Mitchell, continue." "Your Honor, Mr. Carter abandoned his wife while she was in active labor. This is documented by hospital security footage and staff testimony. He refused to authorize payment for her admission and left the premises with another woman, a hospital employee who was subsequently terminated for ethics violations related to her relationship with Mr. Carter." The judge's expression didn't change, but Calvin felt the weight of her attention shift. Ms. Mitchell continued. "Since that time, Mr. Carter has demonstrated unstable behavior. He's been banned from Mercy Heights Medical Center for attempting to violate visitor restrictions. He's violated a restraining order by appearing at my client's residence. And according to his financial disclosure, he's currently living in temporary housing and carrying significant credit card debt." She paused. "We believe supervised visitation is appropriate until Mr. Carter can demonstrate that he can provide a stable, safe environment for his daughter." Calvin's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client made a mistake in leaving the hospital. He acknowledges that. But he has a right to be in his daughter's life. Supervised visitation is extreme." The judge looked at Calvin. "Mr. Carter, is it true you left the hospital while your wife was in labor?" Calvin swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor. But I didn't know. I thought." "Yes or no, Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "And is it true you attempted to visit your wife at the hospital after she'd restricted visitors?" "I was trying to see my daughter." "Yes or no?" "Yes." "And is it true you appeared at her private residence despite a restraining order prohibiting contact?" Calvin's lawyer touched his arm, a warning. "Yes," Calvin said quietly. The judge made a note. "Ms. Mitchell, your client is willing to allow supervised visitation?" "Yes, Your Honor. 2 hours per week at a neutral location with a court-appointed supervisor. My client will cover all costs associated with supervision." The judge looked at Calvin's lawyer. "That seems reasonable given the circumstances." Calvin's lawyer nodded, knowing when to accept the best deal available. Then here's what we're going to do, the judge said. I'm granting Ms. Sinclair full physical and legal custody of the minor child. Mr. Carter will have supervised visitation 2 hours per week, pending a review in 6 months. If Mr. Carter demonstrates stable housing, stable employment, and the ability to follow court orders, we can revisit the arrangement. She looked directly at Calvin. Mr. Carter, you abandoned your wife at the worst possible moment. You violated her trust, her safety, and her dignity. The fact that she's still willing to allow you any access to your daughter is more mercy than you probably deserve. Don't waste it. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, Calvin tried one last time. Naomi, he called across the parking lot. She stopped, her attorneys flanking her, and turned to look at him. It was the first time she'd looked directly at him since the hospital corridor. Can we talk? Calvin asked. Just for a minute. Please. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she walked toward him, her attorneys staying back, but watchful. She stopped 6 feet away. What do you want to say? She asked. Her voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of emotion. Calvin struggled to find words. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I was wrong. About everything. I didn't know. You didn't know I had money. Naomi finished for him. That's what you were going to say, isn't it? Calvin nodded miserably. And if you had known? Would you have stayed? The question hung between them. Calvin wanted to say yes. Wanted to say he would have stayed regardless, that money didn't matter, that he'd made a terrible mistake he'd spend the rest of his life regretting. But Naomi was looking at him with those calm, assessing eyes, and lying felt impossible. I don't know, he admitted. Naomi nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already known. That's the difference between us, Calvin. I knew exactly who you were, and I stayed anyway. I wanted to believe that your character would prove me wrong, that when it mattered most, you'd choose integrity over convenience. She paused. You chose convenience, and now you get to live with that choice. Naomi, please. I know I don't deserve it, but can't we? No, Naomi said simply. We can't. You'll have supervised visitation with Claire. You'll follow the court's orders. And if you demonstrate that you can be a stable, reliable presence in her life, those terms might improve. But you and I? We're done. I love you, Calvin said desperately. Naomi's expression didn't change. No, you don't. You loved the idea of me when it was convenient, when it made you feel important. But you never loved me enough to stay when it was hard. And that's the only kind of love that matters. She turned to walk away. What about Vanessa? Calvin called after her. Did you have to destroy her too? Naomi stopped and looked back over her shoulder. I didn't destroy Vanessa. She destroyed herself by violating ethics standards and professional boundaries. The compliance review would have happened regardless of our personal situation. She made her own choices. And my mother? Her loan being called. Sinclair Capital acquired a portfolio of distressed assets as part of our standard business operations. Your mother's loan was in default long before I knew about your affair. The fact that it's now being handled by my company is coincidence, not revenge. She paused. But if you want to know the truth, Calvin, I'm not going to intervene on her behalf either. She spent years looking down on me, calling me inadequate, treating me like I wasn't good enough for you. Let her learn what it's like to exist without someone else's money propping her up. With that, Naomi walked to her car, her attorneys following. Calvin stood in the courthouse parking lot and watched her drive away. And for the first time, he understood that there would be no grand reconciliation. No dramatic speech where she forgave him. No second chance. She'd already moved on, and he was simply no longer relevant to her future. For years past, Naomi raised Claire in the same estate where she'd grown up, surrounded by stability, structure, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were. Claire was bright, curious, stubborn in the best ways. She had Naomi's eyes and determination. She had her great-grandfather's love of puzzles and patterns. She knew her father existed. Saw him every Saturday afternoon at a supervised visitation center, where Calvin showed up consistently. She'd give him that, and tried his best to be present for 2 hours a week. But Claire didn't ask about him much. Didn't seem particularly troubled by his absence from her daily life. She had her mother, her routine, her world, and that was enough. Naomi had expanded Sinclair Capital's healthcare portfolio, acquiring 3 more hospital systems, and launching a nonprofit initiative to provide free prenatal care to underserved communities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been abandoned while seeking medical care. Now she was ensuring other women wouldn't face the same barriers. The work was meaningful, fulfilling, exactly what her grandfather had hoped she'd do with the resources he'd left her. Calvin's life had contracted. He'd lost his job 6 months after the divorce. Downsizing, his company claimed, though Calvin suspected the real reason was the chaos his personal life had created at work. He'd found another position eventually. Sales manager at a smaller company. Less pay, less prestige, but stable. He lived in a modest apartment in a modest neighborhood. Drove a used car. Managed his finances carefully because there was no safety net anymore, no fallback, no one to bail him out when things got tight. His mother had declared bankruptcy and moved to Florida to live with her sister. She didn't call often. Vanessa had moved to another state and started over with a new nursing license after serving a 2-year suspension. Calvin had heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd married someone, had kids, seemed happy. He was glad for her, in a distant way. Every Saturday, Calvin showed up at the visitation center. He played with Claire, building blocks, coloring books, simple games appropriate for a 4-year-old. He asked about her week, listened to her stories about preschool and her friends and the things she was learning. He never asked about Naomi. He'd learned early that mentioning her mother only made Claire defensive, protective in a way that reminded him painfully of Naomi herself. On Claire's 4th birthday, the supervised visitation restriction was lifted. Calvin could now take Claire for unsupervised visits, day trips, eventually overnight stays as she got older. He'd celebrated quietly, seeing it as progress. But when he'd arrived at the visitation center for their first unsupervised session, he'd found Naomi waiting. She was sitting in the reception area, Claire beside her, both calm and composed. "Naomi," Calvin said, surprised. "I didn't expect. I wanted to talk to you before your first unsupervised visit," Naomi said. She looked at Claire. "Sweetheart, can you go play in the toy corner for a few minutes while I talk to your dad?" Claire nodded and ran off. Naomi gestured to the chairs, and they sat. "I want to be clear about expectations," Naomi said without preamble. "You'll have Claire every other weekend and one evening during the week. You'll pick her up and drop her off on time. You'll follow her routine, early bedtime, healthy meals, limited screen time. If you can't make a scheduled visit, you'll give me 24 hours notice." Calvin nodded. "Of course. And if you ever put her in an unsafe situation, introduce her to anyone unstable, or fail to prioritize her well-being, this arrangement ends immediately." "I understand." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. "You hurt me, Calvin. Badly. But Claire deserves to know her father if you can be the father she deserves. Can you?" Calvin met her eyes. "I'm trying to be. Trying isn't enough. Either you are, or you aren't." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Then, I am. I know I failed you. Failed us. But I won't fail her." Naomi nodded slowly. "Then we have an understanding." She stood. Calvin stood too. "Naomi, thank you for giving me this chance. I'm not doing it for you," Naomi said quietly. "I'm doing it for Claire. She asked if she could have sleepovers at your house like her friends do with their dads. And I want her to have a relationship with you if you can handle it." She paused. "But if you can't, if you disappoint her the way you disappointed me, I won't give you another chance. This is it. I understand." Naomi called Claire over, gave her a hug, and reminded her to listen to her father. Then she left. Calvin watched her go, driving away in a car he couldn't afford, to a life he'd never be part of, and felt the full weight of everything he'd lost. But he also felt something else. Determination. He couldn't fix the past, couldn't undo the choice he'd made in that hospital corridor, but he could show up for his daughter, could be present, could prove, even if only to himself, that he was capable of being better than he'd been. It wouldn't change anything with Naomi. That door was closed. Permanently. But maybe, he could be the father Claire deserved. It was the smallest possible redemption, but it was the only one available. 7 years after that night in the hospital corridor, Naomi sat in her home office reviewing quarterly reports. Sinclair Capital had exceeded projections again. The healthcare division was thriving. The prenatal care initiative had served over 15,000 women. Her phone rang. "Claire's school. Miss Sinclair? This is Principal Morrison. Everything's fine, but Claire asked us to call you. Her class is doing a family tree project, and she has some questions about her father's side of the family. Naomi smiled. Tell her I'll talk to her about it tonight. And if she needs to include her father in the project, that's fine. Perfect. Thank you. Naomi hung up and looked out the window at the gardens her grandfather had planted decades ago. Calvin was part of Claire's story. That was reality. Naomi wouldn't erase him or poison Claire against him. But he was a minor character in Claire's story. Not the villain. Not the hero. Just a person who'd made choices and was living with the consequences. The real story, Claire's story, Naomi's story, was about everything they'd built without him. The stability, the love, the future. Some people lose everything not because someone destroys them, Naomi thought, but because they are no longer invited into the future. Calvin had walked out of that hospital, and Naomi had simply closed the door behind him. Not with anger, not with speeches, not with revenge, just with the quiet, irreversible finality of a choice already made. She turned back to her reports. There was work to do, and a daughter to raise, and a future to build. The end.